Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing Cys-Loop receptors. Okay, right, so we're currently in the process of discussing different types of Cys-Loop receptors in a little bit more detail. Okay, so we're currently discussing the GABA A receptors, which is a large family of receptors in humans. Okay, so we've discussed that in humans there are 19 different subunits to build GABA A receptors. Okay, and these are called alpha 1 to alpha 6, beta 1 to beta 3, gamma 1 to gamma 3, then there is the rho 1 to rho 3, and then there's the delta, epsilon, pi, and theta GABA A receptor subunits. Now, we've discussed that the great majority of GABA A receptors that are actually used in the central nervous system are of this alpha, beta, gamma form, okay, where to build a GABA A receptor of this form, what you do is you select one alpha type GABA A receptor subunit, you select one beta type GABA A receptor subunit, and one gamma type GABA A receptor subunit. You then take two of those identical alpha type GABA A receptor subunits and put them in these two sockets here. You then take two of those identical beta GABA A receptor subunits and put them in these two sockets here, and then you put one copy of your gamma GABA A receptor subunit that you've selected in there. So that's how you build one of these alpha, beta, gamma GABA A receptor subunit pentamers. Okay, right. We then discussed notable examples of alpha, beta, gamma GABA A receptors. Okay, so one of the main ones, in fact the main one, is listed here, okay, and all that I then have to tell you is which alpha subunit you choose, which beta subunit you choose, and which gamma subunit you choose. So in this one you have chosen the alpha 1 GABA A receptor alpha subunit, you've chosen the beta 2 GABA A receptor beta 2 subunit, and you've then chosen the gamma 2 GABA A receptor gamma subunit. Okay, then some other notable examples which are also very commonly found in the CNS are these ones here, which have slightly different choices of alpha and beta subunits to go in these sockets. Right, okay, so what I now want to discuss is some clinical correlates then of the GABA A receptors. Okay, so the first thing I want to discuss is the benzodiazepine drugs, which are used to treat anxiety and insomnia. In some cases, it's quite rare now for anxiety to be treated with benzodiazepines because of the problems of tolerance and dependence, which we'll come on to. Okay, but in principle, they can be used to treat anxiety. They are very effective in treating anxiety. It's just the problems of tolerance and dependence, which means that they aren't really that often actually used to treat anxiety anymore. Okay, right, so let's discuss then the benzodiazepine drugs. So firstly I want to tell you what is the characteristic feature that all benzodiazepines that are used to treat anxiety and insomnia actually have. Okay, and strictly speaking, the benzodiazepines that people usually mean when they say benzodiazepines, which are the ones which are used to treat anxiety and insomnia, should really be called the 1,4 benzodiazepines, okay? Because that's the chemical structure they all contain. They contain a 1,4 benzodiazepine ring. Okay, so let me show you what the structure of a 1,4 benzodiazepine ring is. Well, firstly, before we actually discuss what a 1,4 benzodiazepine ring is, let's firstly discuss what a 1,4 diazepine ring is. Because basically, to create a 1,4 benzodiazepine ring, all you do is attach a benzene ring onto a 1,4 diazepine ring. Okay, so let's start with what a 1,4 diazepine ring is. So basically these are 7-membered rings where you have 2 nitrogens in the ring and then 5 carbons. Okay, so basically one of the nitrogens is then right at the top up here. Okay, and then we're going to have some carbons coming off that, like so. Okay, so these are 2 carbons shown here in the corners, and I'm showing a skeletal formula, so I don't need to show carbon atoms, I implicitly show them by corners. Okay, then there's another one there at that corner. Okay, bond here to a nitrogen, and then another one here. Okay, so let me just highlight up the carbons here. So there is one corner supposed to be there, one corner supposed to be there, one corner supposed to be there, one there, and one there. Okay, right. We also need some double bonds on here. There's a double bond there, double bond there, and a double bond there, and then this nitrogen is then going to have a hydrogen coming off it. That is the structure of a 1,4-diazepine ring. So what does this 1,4 refer to? Well, this nitrogen right at the top here is considered number 1, okay? Then 2, 3, and we'll count round to here 4. So that's what the 4 is for, what the 1 and the 4 are for. They are telling you where the nitrogen atoms basically are in the diazepine ring. So all diazepine rings have these 2 nitrogens, but you need to know which position is this nitrogen here basically, because you can move this around and create different diazepine rings. Okay, this nitrogen at number 1 is always there, okay, but you can move this one around. It could be up here in position 2, and that would be a 1,2 diazepine ring. Or it could be here, and that would be a 1,3 diazepine ring. Okay, or it could be where it is, and that's a 1,4 diazepine ring. Obviously, if you moved it into these positions, then it would just be by symmetry the same thing as the ones that we've just been through. So you wouldn't say a 1,5 diazepine ring, for instance. That would be equivalent to a 1,4 diazepine ring, and so on for 1,6 and 1,7 diazepine rings. Okay, right, so that then is the structure of a 1,4 diazepine ring. How do we create this then into the 1,4 benzodiazepine structure, which is the structure that's going to be in all of these drugs that are used to treat anxiety and insomnia and which work on GABA A receptors? Okay, so the 1,4 benzodiazepine structure then. So first I just need to copy out my 1,4 diazepine ring here. Okay, so this 7-membered ring here. Here are my 2 carbons. And then we'll extend it down here. Here's that second nitrogen. And now we'll put in the double bonds. So 1 double bond there, 1 double bond there, 1 here. Okay, and then we need a hydrogen off that nitrogen up there. Okay, so that's the 1,4 diazepine ring. And now what we're going to stick on is a benzene ring off the side here. Okay, so here is the 6-membered benzene ring going off the side here, and we'll have a double bond there, and also a double bond there, and that now creates the structure which is called a 1,4 benzodiazepine ring. Okay, and all of the 1,4 benzodiazepine drugs are going to contain one of these 1,4 benzodiazepine ring structures basically within them. Okay, so let me give you some notable examples of 1,4 benzodiazepine drugs which work on GABA A receptors and which can be used to treat anxiety and also insomnia. Okay, so some very notable examples then. One is Diazepam. Diazepam is probably the most famous of all of the benzodiazepines. It's more commonly known by its infamous trade name, which is Valium. Okay. Other examples of 1,4 benzodiazepines are chlordiazepoxide. That one's notable because it was the first one ever to be synthesized. Okay, so chlordiazepoxide. Okay, and then another notable one is lorazepam. Okay, so 3 notable examples of 1,4 benzodiazepine drugs. Okay, and from now on we'll just refer to them as benzodiazepines, but be aware that there are also the 1,2 and 1,3 benzodiazepines which have very different properties. Okay, right, so let's now talk about these benzodiazepine drugs. How do they affect GABA A receptors? Okay, well basically in certain alpha, beta, gamma type GABA A receptors, which we know are the main type of GABA A receptors, you have a site called a benzodiazepine binding site. And basically this is at one of these interfaces that doesn't bind GABA. Okay, and it's between the gamma and the alpha subunit here. Okay, so I won't do it in vivid purple because that's how I've shown the GABA binding sites. I'll do it in turquoise. So basically, in some alpha, beta, gamma type GABA A receptors, you have a benzodiazepine binding site between the positive aspect of the alpha subunit here and the negative aspect of the gamma subunit there. Okay, so we've discussed how in all cis-loop ligand-gated ion channels you have potentially 5 binding sites for ligands. Okay, because remember, all of these interfaces have those 6 loops which make binding sites. It's just that not all of those binding sites will have the correct residues to actually bind certain ligands. Okay, and in certain alpha, beta, gamma, GABA A receptors, you have a binding site here between the alpha and the gamma subunit, like so, in this interface here, which is capable of binding 1,4-benzodiazepines. Okay? Right, so what are the requirements on the alpha, beta, gamma, GABA A receptor in order for it to actually have this benzodiazepine binding site? And I think I'll just write down quickly. So BZD is an abbreviation for benzodiazepine. Okay, so we'll call this the benzodiazepine binding site, and I'll just colour code this in by underlining it in turquoise there. Okay, right. So what are the requirements? Because not all alpha, beta, gamma, GABA A receptors do have a benzodiazepine binding site. So what are the requirements then? Okay, well, there is a requirement on the alpha subunit and there is a requirement on the gamma subunit. Now that's obvious because those are the 2 subunits involved in this interface, okay? It does not matter what beta subunit you have, because the beta subunits don't make any difference to this interface between the alpha and the gamma subunit there. Okay, so basically the gamma subunit has to be gamma 2, so that's one of the requirements. Okay, and we've seen that in most of the main alpha, beta, gamma, GABA A receptors that are actually important, gamma 2 is going to be the gamma subunit, so we can tick that one off straight away. Okay, and the alpha subunit is a little bit more of a loose requirement here. It can either be alpha 1, or it can be alpha 2, or it can be alpha 3, or finally it can be alpha 5. Okay, so note all of these incredibly important alpha, beta, gamma, GABA A receptors that I've listed off here fulfill both of those requirements basically of having a gamma 2 subunit adjacent to an alpha subunit that is either alpha 1, 2, 3 or 5. And therefore all of these main GABA A receptors that I've listed here are going to have a benzodiazepine binding site where a 1,4-benzodiazepine drug is capable of binding and causing some effect on the GABA A receptor. So what is the effect then that benzodiazepines have on the GABA A receptor? Well, basically, they cause conformational changes in the GABA binding sites, which result in the GABA binding sites increasing their affinity for GABA. Okay, so the effect of benzodiazepines binding in the benzodiazepine binding site is to increase the affinity for binding GABA. Okay, so increase GABA binding affinity. Okay, and I'll just put increase GABA affinity. Now, what does that then mean? Well, that means that when a postsynaptic neuron releases a certain amount of GABA onto, when the presynaptic neuron releases a certain amount of GABA onto the postsynaptic neuron, I'll just draw a little picture here. Okay, if we've got an inhibitory synapse here, here's the presynaptic neuron releasing GABA onto our postsynaptic neuron. Okay, the postsynaptic membrane will have GABA A receptors in it here. Okay, and when we usually release a certain amount of GABA, we'll get a certain fraction of our GABA A receptors getting 2 molecules of GABA bound to them and therefore opening. And that will produce us, therefore, a certain chloride current into the cytoplasm of the postsynaptic cell, and will therefore get a certain inhibitory effect. Okay? Now, basically, if we douse this postsynaptic cell in our benzodiazepine, then benzodiazepines will bind to those GABA A receptors which have benzodiazepine binding sites, but we know now that most of the GABA A receptors are going to have benzodiazepine binding sites, because the main ones that we've seen, that are the main ones that are found in the brain, do indeed fulfill those requirements to have a benzodiazepine binding site. So the benzodiazepines will bind to GABA A receptors, and now what's going to happen is those GABA A receptors that have benzodiazepine molecules bound to them are going to have a greater affinity for GABA, and that means that a greater fraction of those GABA A receptors are going to end up getting 2 molecules of GABA binding to them when you release the same amount of GABA onto the postsynaptic neuron. And that means now that more GABA A receptors are going to open, and therefore the chloride current that you get is going to increase. So basically the inhibitory effect on the postsynaptic neuron of this inhibitory synapse is going to go up. You're going to have stronger inhibition being provided to neurons all over the brain, basically, when you take one of these benzodiazepine drugs. Okay? Now, for reasons that are not well understood, inhibiting the activity all over the brain in this way is helpful in treating anxiety and also in treating insomnia. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about anxiety and insomnia. Okay, so we'll start off with anxiety. So anxiety is basically pathological fear, okay? It's the fear response being initiated when it shouldn't really be initiated. Okay, so the fear response is something that is supposed to be initiated when you are genuinely under threat. Okay, so when some polar bear has just arrived or something along those lines. Okay, when your life is generally under threat, you're supposed to initiate the fear response. When it's being initiated in situations that are not dangerous, that is what is called anxiety, basically, and it's not something that anyone likes to have. Okay, so there are 6 major anxiety disorders. So anxiety isn't just one disorder, there are loads of different anxiety disorders. Now let me just summarize some of these major anxiety disorders. So one of them is PTSD, which stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, and in post-traumatic stress disorder, what happens is someone has been through an extremely traumatic experience. So generally it's people who have gone to war, basically, and seen horrendous things whilst at war. Okay, and then they come back from war, and then come back to normal society, and then whenever they relive this horrendous experience, whenever they remember these horrendous experiences, they then suddenly get fear responses being initiated. So whenever you recall the horrible past experience, basically, the horrendous traumatic experience, then you get fear responses being initiated, you get anxiety, basically. Okay, so that's what post-traumatic stress disorder is. It's a fear response being initiated every time you just recall this previous horrendous experience. Okay, another form of anxiety is OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay, so basically in obsessive compulsive disorder you have obsessions which then lead to compulsions, and if you try and resist the compulsions, resist the urge to do the compulsion, you then get a fear attack being initiated. So for instance, some people obsess over their front door being locked. Okay, and even if they know that they have locked the front door, they will have obsessions about whether the front door is locked. And then the compulsion, a compulsion is a sort of involuntary behavior, basically. The compulsion is then to go and check that the front door is locked. Okay, so basically an example of obsessive compulsive disorder would be if you always have these obsessions about making sure that the front door is locked. Okay, and then the compulsion would be that you have to go and check the front door every time you have the obsession, even though you actually know it is locked. But if you try and resist the compulsion, if you try to tell yourself, don't be stupid, the front door is locked, I don't need to go and check it, you then have a panic attack, basically. You have an initiation of the fear response, okay, and therefore you get anxious. Okay, so that's obsessive compulsive disease, or obsessive compulsive disorder rather, where you get anxiety attacks when you try and resist the urge to perform the compulsion. Okay, another form of anxiety disorder is what's called social anxiety disorder. Okay, now in social anxiety disorder you get the fear response being initiated whenever you are exposed to other people, basically, particularly when you have to perform in front of people. Okay, so public speaking, huge fear of public speaking is part of social anxiety disorder. Okay, so being around other people basically initiates anxious fear responses basically in you, and you're in a state of anxiety around other people. Okay, that's what's known as social anxiety disorder. Another one is generalized anxiety disorder, which is abbreviated down to GAD. Okay, and this one is where you are just chronically having a fear response initiated, basically. Okay, so you never have a single moment in life where you're not feeling anxious, basically. Okay, so generalized anxiety disorder is not a nice one. Okay, then there is panic disorder. Okay, and in panic disorder, you get very, very, very intense fear responses being initiated. You have panic attacks in response to nothing. Okay, so there are spontaneous panic attacks. Now, a panic attack is where you get a really, really intense fear response being initiated. A fear response that really should be initiated in a life or death situation. Okay, so if you've ever had a panic attack, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's basically where all you want to do is run. You can't think straight. All you want to do is just run. Okay, and that's what's initiated just spontaneously in people with panic disorder. Okay, so for no reason, you just spontaneously get panic attacks occurring. Okay, and obviously that can be very debilitating. Okay, and then the final major anxiety disorder that I want to mention is phobias. Okay, and in phobias, you initiate, again, very powerful fear responses, which can go up to full-on panic attacks in response to a certain phobic object. Okay, so a phobic object is some trigger. Okay, so for instance, maybe a dog. Okay, maybe you've got a phobia to dogs. So there is a trigger to the fear response in this case. So that's what distinguishes it from panic disorder. In panic disorder, the panic attack is just initiated to nothing, basically. It's spontaneous. Okay, in phobias, it's exposure to a certain phobic object that initiates a completely out of proportion fear response, basically, that can go on to becoming actually a full-on panic attack. Okay, so in phobias, you initiate fear responses to objects that just do not warrant them whatsoever, basically. Okay, and that's another form of anxiety. Okay, right. So benzodiazepines are effective in treating all these different forms of anxiety. They are very, very effective at reducing your level of fear, basically, at reducing your anxious state. Okay, the problem with benzodiazepines is that they cannot be used long term, okay, because they lead to tolerance and dependence, which I'll mention in just a moment. Okay, so before we go on to discuss tolerance and dependence, let me just talk also about their use to treat insomnia. Okay, so not only can they be used to treat anxiety, but they're also very effective at treating insomnia. Okay, so basically, benzodiazepines are hypnotics. So a hypnotic is any agent which makes you go to sleep, basically. They decrease the amount of time it takes you to get to sleep, so they can be used as sleeping pills in the treatment of insomnia. Okay, but again, they cannot be used long term. They can only be used to treat acute insomnia. They can only be used to treat acute anxiety. And let me now explain why. Okay, so basically benzodiazepines have the properties that they induce tolerance and dependence. So this is the problem. Okay, so these are two very key concepts, tolerance and dependence. What do these mean? So tolerance basically means that as you continue taking the drug, the amount of the drug that you have to take in order to get the same effect goes up. Okay, so tolerance is a gradual tolerance building up to the drug. Okay, as you continue to take the drug, it no longer has the same effect, basically. Your body begins to tolerate it, and to get the initial beneficial effect of the drug again back, you have to now take bigger doses. Okay, so the drug loses its effect is the concept of tolerance. Drugs lose effect. Okay, right. What then is the concept of dependence? Dependence is the concept that you begin to become dependent on the drug. Okay, so it begins to become the case that you can't function normally without the drug anymore. So normal function requires the drug, and therefore when you're removed from the drug, when you stop taking the drug, you're then going to have withdrawal symptoms, basically, where your body no longer functions normally. So normal function requires drug taking. Okay, right. So indeed, if you take benzodiazepines for a long time and then try and come off them, then it's very difficult because your body no longer functions normally without the drug, basically. Okay, so for instance, when you come off benzodiazepines, generally you get increased anxiety. Anxiety goes up much more than it was originally. Okay. And things like that, basically. So benzodiazepines do trigger a withdrawal when you come off them. Okay, and they can even actually trigger tremors, basically, when you come off them. However, they do not cause the same level of psychological dependence that certain other addictive agents cause. So, for instance, morphine and things like that. When you have become addicted to morphine, then you have intense cravings when you stop taking the drug for the drug. Okay, benzodiazepines cause that to an extent, but nowhere near the level that drugs like morphine cause it. So that's not too much of a problem. So when I say dependence, it's not quite the level of dependence that you have on things like morphine, where there is intense cravings as soon as you stop taking the drug. Okay, but it does cause certain nasty physiological withdrawal symptoms when you come off them. Okay, right, so we'll call it there for this video, and in the next video what we'll talk about is a form of epilepsy, which is generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus, which is linked to heritable mutations in GABA A receptor subunits.